In the muddy streets of Iron Creek, Wyoming, a woman's life was once valued at exactly one single crumpled dollar bill. They called her the Dry Well, a cruel name for a wife who couldn't give her husband a son. The town gathered to watch her humiliation, expecting her to be sold off to a brothel or a drifter. But then the ground shook. A shadow fell over the auction block, a man the size of a grizzly bear, with eyes like frozen whiskey. He didn't buy her for work. He didn't buy her for pleasure. And what happened in that mountain cabin would change the history of the territory forever. This is the story of Clara and the giant who knew her true worth. The air inside the Broken Spur saloon smelled of stale beer, wet wool, and the sharp metallic tang of desperation. It was late October 1878, and the wind outside was already biting with the promise of a hard Montana winter. But the chill inside the saloon was far worse. Clara O'Malley stood on top of a makeshift wooden crate near the billiard table, her head bowed so low her chin touched the rough wool of her grey dress. She fixed her eyes on a knot in the floorboards, refusing to look at the sea of leering, bearded faces that surrounded her. She was 24 years old, but her face was gaunt, her eyes shadowed by years of weeping that had long since run dry. "Do I hear 50 cents?" Tobias Crutchfield bellowed, swaying unsteadily with a bottle of rot-gut whiskey in one hand. He was a wiry, mean-spirited man, with a face pockmarked by smallpox and a soul rotted by greed. 50 cents for a woman who can cook a stew, mend a shirt, and scrub a floor until your reflection mocks you. Just don't expect no squalling brats, boys. She's as barren as the Badlands. A ripple of cruel laughter tore through the room. Clara flinched, her hands trembling where they were clasped in front of her. This was the custom in some of the darker corners of the frontier, a wife sale. It was illegal, immoral, and entirely binding in the eyes of men like Tobias. He had convinced the local circuit judge, a corrupt man named Elias Thorne, to look the other way. Tobias wanted a new wife, a younger girl from the Miller's family, who was already showing a swell in her belly, and he needed Clara gone. "She ain't worth 50 cents if she can't breed, Tobias," shouted a miner from the back, a man known as One-Eyed Jack, using a tone that made Clara's skin crawl. "A mule is worth more than a barren woman." Tobias spat on the floor near Clara's boots. "Fine then. I want her gone. She's bad luck. She's a curse on my house. The first man to give me a silver dollar takes her. Lock, stock, and useless barrel." The room went silent. $1 was an insult. It was less than the price of a good bottle of whiskey. It was a declaration that she was trash. Clara closed her eyes, praying for the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She thought of her mother, buried back in Missouri, and thanked God she wasn't alive to see this. "Let me die," she thought. "Just let the winter take me." "No takers," Tobias sneered, raising his hand to strike her, a habit he had formed over 5 long, childless years. "Then maybe I'll just leave her for the wolves." The saloon doors swung open with such force that the hinges screamed. The gust of wind that followed extinguished the oil lamps near the entrance, plunging the front of the room into shadow. Silence fell over the crowd, heavy and sudden. A man stepped out of the swirling snow and into the dim light. He had to duck his head to clear the doorframe. He was immense, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that spanned the width of a wagon seat. He wore a coat made from the pelt of a massive black bear, the fur still thick and dark, and his boots thudded against the floorboards like thunder. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a battered Stetson and a beard that was thick and tangled, the color of charcoal. "Kevin?" someone whispered fearfully. Kevin Kincaid. They called him Bear Kincaid. He was a mountain man who lived high up in the peaks of desolation, a place where civilized men didn't tread. Rumors about him were as plentiful as pine needles. Some said he had killed a grizzly with his bare hands. Others said he was a deserter from the Civil War who had massacred his entire platoon. He came to town only twice a year for supplies, and he never spoke more than was necessary. The giant walked through the crowd, men parting like water before a ship's prow. He stopped in front of the crate where Clara stood. Up close, the smell of him was overwhelming. Wood smoke, pine resin, and old leather. Tobias, emboldened by liquor, puffed out his chest. "You want her, Kincaid? She's a dry heifer, useless for a man's legacy. But she's cheap." Kevin didn't look at Tobias. He looked at Clara. Slowly, Clara lifted her head. She found herself looking up and up into eyes that shocked her. They weren't the eyes of a monster. They were a startling, clear blue, contrasting sharply with his weather-beaten, scarred face. There was no lust in them. There was no mockery. There was only a deep, terrifying intensity. Kevin reached into his coat pocket. His hand, the size of a shovel blade, withdrew a single silver dollar. It caught the light of the remaining lanterns, shining pure and bright. He didn't hand it to Tobias. He flipped it into the air. It landed with a heavy clink in Tobias's whiskey glass, splashing liquor into the drunkard's eyes. "Sold," Kevin rumbled. His voice was deep, vibrating in Clara's very bones, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "She's yours, you giant freak," Tobias laughed, wiping his eyes. "No refunds when you find out she's empty inside." Kevin turned his gaze to Tobias. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Speak again," Kevin said softly, "and I will tear your tongue from your head." Tobias snapped his mouth shut, the color draining from his face. Kevin turned back to Clara. He didn't grab her arm or drag her. He simply extended one massive hand, palm up. It was calloused, scarred, and stained with earth, but it was held steady. Clara hesitated. Taking that hand meant leaving the world of towns and people. It meant going into the wild with a man who looked capable of snapping her spine with a hug. But staying meant death, or worse. She placed her small, trembling hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, swallowing her hand completely. But his grip was surprisingly gentle. "Come," he said. He lifted her off the crate as if she weighed no more than a sack of feathers. Without a backward glance at the husband who had sold her or the town that had scorned her, Kevin Kincaid led his $1 wife out into the freezing night. The journey up the mountain was a blur of terror and cold. Kevin had a horse, a massive Clydesdale mix named Goliath that looked as formidable as its master, but he didn't ride. He lifted Clara onto the saddle, wrapping her in a heavy woolen blanket that smelled of him, while he walked ahead, leading the horse by the reins. They traveled for hours. The town of Iron Creek faded into a cluster of twinkling lights far below, and then disappeared entirely as the dense forest swallowed them. The snow began to fall harder, large flakes drifting down in the silence. Clara gripped the pommel of the saddle until her knuckles were white. Her mind was racing with horrific scenarios. Why did he buy me? She wondered. Men like him. They live alone for a reason. Is he going to eat me? Make me a slave? She watched his broad back as he trudged through the snow. He moved with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. He didn't stumble. He didn't slow down. He seemed a part of the forest itself, an elemental force carving a path through the wilderness. "Where are we going?" she finally whispered, her voice snatched away by the wind. Kevin didn't stop, but he turned his head slightly. "Home." That was the only word he spoke for 4 hours. By the time they reached a clearing, Clara was numb with cold despite the blanket. Through the swirling white, she saw a structure. It wasn't the dilapidated shack she had expected. It was a sturdy, sprawling cabin built of massive logs, chinked tightly against the weather. Smoke curled invitingly from a stone chimney. There was a barn nearby, and the sound of running water from a creek that hadn't yet frozen over. Kevin halted the horse. He walked back to her, and before she could try to dismount, his hands were at her waist. He lifted her down, but her legs, stiff from the cold and the ride, buckled underneath her. She gasped, expecting to hit the snow. Instead, she was swept up into his arms, cradled against his chest. He carried her to the door, kicked it open, and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a physical blow. The cabin was illuminated by the glow of a dying fire in a massive hearth. It was clean, shockingly so. There were furs on the floor, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and shelves lined with books. Clara blinked. Yes, books. Leather-bound volumes stacked neatly. He set her down in a rocking chair near the fire. "Stay," he commanded. He went back outside to tend to the horse. Clara sat there, shivering, her eyes darting around the room. There was a large bed in the corner, covered in a buffalo robe, a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove. It was a home, a lonely home, but a home. When Kevin returned, he bolted the heavy door. He took off his hat and coat, revealing a mane of unruly black hair and arms that were thick with muscle. He rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt and knelt by the fire, adding logs until the flames roared to life. He then moved to the stove, ladling something from a pot that had been kept warm. He brought a wooden bowl to her. "Eat," he said. It was venison stew, thick with potatoes and carrots. Clara realized she hadn't eaten in 2 days. She ate ravenously, the heat spreading through her chest. Kevin watched her from the other side of the room, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. When she was finished, the silence stretched, thick and awkward. Clara knew what came next. She was a wife. He had bought her. This was the transaction. She began to unbutton the top of her dress, her fingers trembling violently. Tears pricked her eyes. "Just get it over with," she told herself. "Don't cry. Don't make him angry." "What are you doing?" Kevin's voice was sharp, startling her. She froze, her hand at her throat. I am preparing for bed," she stammered, looking at the floor. "I know my duties, Mr. Kincaid. I know I am barren, and I am not pretty. But I will do as you wish." Kevin pushed off the wall and crossed the room in 2 strides. Clara flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. She felt his hand touch her chin, tilting her face up. But he didn't strike her. "Open your eyes, Clara," he said. She opened them. He was kneeling in front of her, bringing his face level with hers. For the first time, she saw the lines of pain etched around his eyes. "You think I bought you for that?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "Why else?" she whispered. "I was $1." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I bought you because Tobias was going to kill you, one way or another. I saw a woman surrounded by wolves." He stood up and walked over to the large bed. He grabbed the buffalo robe and a pillow, then threw them onto the rug in front of the fire. "You take the bed," he said, pointing to the mattress. "I sleep here." Clara stared at him, bewildered. "But you paid—" "I paid $1 to stop a sin," Kevin grunted, lying down on the rug and turning his back to her. "I have lived alone for 10 years, woman. I don't need a whore. I need peace. Sleep." Clara sat in the rocking chair for a long time, watching the rise and fall of the giant's breathing. He was asleep within minutes. Slowly she stood and walked to the bed. The sheets were flannel, soft and clean. She climbed in, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee. But inside, with the fire crackling and the monster sleeping on the floor to protect her virtue, Clara O'Malley felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Safety. But as she drifted off, a thought nagged at her. Tobias had called her barren. Everyone knew it. Kevin had bought a broken thing. What would happen when he realized that even if he didn't want her body, she could give him Dita's no future? What would happen when the winter thawed? She didn't know that the thaw would come much sooner than spring, and it would start with the ice around the giant's heart. The first week in the high country was a lesson in silence. Clara woke that first morning to an empty bed and a cold cabin. Panic, sharp and immediate, seized her chest. She sat up, clutching the buffalo robe, half expecting to see Tobias standing there with a belt, or worse, to find herself abandoned in the wilderness. But the fire had been banked carefully to keep the coals alive, and on the rough-hewn table sat a tin cup of coffee, still steaming, and a strip of dried venison. Kevin was gone. She moved to the window, scraping away the frost with a fingernail. Outside, the world was a blinding white sheet. The wind whipped snow off the peaks in plumes that looked like smoke. She saw footprints, huge, deep trenches in the snow, leading towards the tree line. He kept me, she thought, the realization settling in her stomach like a stone. He didn't throw me out. Driven by a lifetime of conditioning that her worth was tied only to her labor, Clara set to work. She found a broom made of twigs and swept the floor until the wood grain shone. She located a sack of flour and a tin of lard, her hands working automatically to knead dough for biscuits. She scrubbed the cast-iron skillet with sand and grease. She wanted to be indispensable. If she was useful, perhaps he wouldn't beat her. If she made the cabin warm, perhaps he wouldn't sell her when the spring thaw came. When the door finally opened hours later, the sun was dipping behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. Kevin entered, carrying the carcass of a small buck over one shoulder, as easily as a lady carries a parasol. He stomped the snow from his boots, the cabin instantly shrinking with his presence. He looked at the swept floor. He looked at the biscuits cooling on the rack. He looked at Clara, who stood by the stove, hands clasped, trembling slightly. He grunted, dropping the deer on a workbench near the door. "You worked," he said. It wasn't a question. I wanted to earn my keep, Mr. Kincaid," she whispered. He pulled off his gloves, his blue eyes assessing her. "My name is Kevin, and you earned your keep the moment you stepped away from that bastard in town." The days bled into a routine. Kevin spoke little, but his presence was a constant, heavy comfort. He chopped wood with a rhythmic thwack-crack that echoed through the valley. He checked his trap lines. He mended the barn roof. But it was the evenings that frightened and fascinated Clara the most. One night, 2 weeks after her arrival, a storm rolled in, rattling the heavy timber walls. Clara sat in the rocker, mending a tear in Kevin's flannel shirt. The shirt was so large it draped over her lap like a blanket. Kevin sat in the armchair, a book in his hands. It was a volume of poetry by Keats. Clara watched him, bewildered. Tobias couldn't read. Most men in Iron Creek couldn't read beyond a wanted poster. But this giant, this wild beast, traced the lines of text with a finger that had likely snapped the necks of wolves. "You read?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Kevin didn't look up. "A man can be large and literate, Clara. They aren't mutually exclusive. I didn't mean—" she flushed. "It's just, they say you're a savage." He closed the book, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He looked at the fire, his expression darkening. "They say a lot of things. They say you're barren. Are they right?" Clara flinched. The needle pricked her finger, a tiny bead of blood blooming on the grey fabric. "Yes," she said, her voice hollow. 5 years with Tobias. He tried. Every night. There was never a baby. Not even a flutter. I am dried up. A dry well, he called me. Kevin stood up and walked to the fire, turning his back to her. He braced his hands on the stone mantel, his head hanging low. The firelight cast his shadow across the ceiling, stretching it into something monstrous. "I had a wife once," he said. His voice was so low Clara had to lean forward to hear it. "Before the war, before the mountains. Her name was Sarah." Clara stopped breathing. This was the first time he had offered a piece of himself. "She died?" Clara asked softly. "Childbirth," Kevin rasped. "The baby, a boy. He died with her. I was a big man then. Strong. But I wasn't strong enough to save them. I held them both, Clara. My hands." He looked at his massive palms. "These hands are good for killing. They are good for breaking stone and felling trees. They are not good for holding fragile things." He turned to face her, his eyes glistening with a wetness he refused to let fall. "I didn't buy you to breed, Clara. I bought you because I know what it is to be looked at like you're broken. I came up here to die alone, to let the family line end with me. I don't want a son. I don't want to risk burying another woman." Clara felt a crack in her heart, a sudden rush of empathy that overwhelmed her fear. He wasn't a beast. He was a man terrified of his own strength, paralyzed by a grief he had carried for a decade. She stood up and walked to him. He towered over her, but she didn't shrink back. She reached out and took his hand, the hand he claimed was only good for killing, and pressed it to her cheek. "You aren't killing me, Kevin," she whispered. "You saved me." He stiffened, his breath hitching. For a moment she thought he would pull away. Instead, his thumb brushed her cheekbone, rough skin against soft, erasing a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You're a foolish woman," he grumbled, but there was no heat in it. "Go to bed." That night, the distance between the bed and the rug didn't feel quite so far. November turned into December, bringing a cold so profound it seemed to freeze time itself. The cabin was buried in snow up to the windowsills. It was a world of white silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the hearth. Clara and Kevin moved around each other like planets in a slow orbit. The fear was gone, replaced by a domestic intimacy that was confusing. She washed his back when he came in from the cold, his skin steaming in the warm air. He carved her a wooden comb, smoothing the wood for hours until it was like silk. They ate together, read together, and existed in a bubble of safety. But the barren label still hung over Clara. She had her monthly bleeding in November, and again in December. Each time she hid the rags with shame, a reminder of her defectiveness. Even though Kevin said he didn't want children, she felt she was failing him as a woman. She was just a mouth to feed. Then came the blizzard of January 1879. It started as a low grey wall in the north and hit the mountain with the force of a hammer. For 3 days they couldn't open the door. The wind screamed like a dying animal. On the 4th morning, the silence returned, but the temperature plummeted. Kevin needed to check the livestock in the barn. "Stay inside," he warned, wrapping a scarf around his face. "The cold out there. It can freeze your lungs in a minute." He was gone for an hour, then 2. Clara paced the floor. She checked the window, but the frost was too thick. "He's fine," she told herself. "He's the bear." Then she heard a sound. A heavy thud against the door, followed by a groan. She threw the bolt and hauled the heavy timber door open. Kevin fell in, crashing to the floor. "Kevin!" she screamed. He was conscious, but barely. His leg was dragging, and blood was soaking through his heavy trousers. "Wolf!" he gritted out, his teeth chattering violently. "Trapline. Startled a pack. Got one. Other one got me." Clara didn't think. She didn't panic. The weeping girl from the saloon was gone. She grabbed his shoulders and pulled. He was over 300 pounds, dead weight. She braced her feet, grunting with effort, and dragged him inch by inch towards the fire. She kicked the door shut against the swirling snow. "I need whiskey," she said, her voice shaking, but commanding. "And the needle." For the next 6 hours, Clara was the doctor. She cut away the blood-soaked denim. The bite was deep, jagged, tearing into the muscle of his thigh. She cleaned it with boiling water and whiskey, ignoring his roars of pain. She threaded the needle and stitched the flesh back together, her hands steady, despite the blood slicking her fingers. Kevin passed out from the pain halfway through. When he woke, it was dark. The fire was roaring. He was lying in the bed, her bed. Clara was slumped in the rocking chair next to him, asleep, her hand resting on his arm. He tried to move, and the pain shot up his leg, waking him fully. It also woke Clara. She jumped up, her eyes wide. "You're awake. The fever, you were burning up." "You stitched me?" he rasped, his throat dry. "Someone had to," she said, bringing a cup of water to his lips. She supported his head, her fingers tangling in his thick hair. Kevin drank, then looked at her. He really looked at her. Her hair was loose, falling around her shoulders in waves of auburn he had never truly noticed. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were fierce. She had dragged a giant. She had sown his flesh. "You are strong, Clara," he whispered. "I had to be," she said softly. "I couldn't let you die." "Who would chop the wood?" He chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Is that all I am? An axe?" "No," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You are everything." The air in the room shifted. The smell of blood and antiseptic faded, replaced by something heavier, older. Kevin reached out and took her hand. He pulled gently this time. "Clara, you're hurt, Kevin. You shouldn't." "I'm hurt in the leg, woman. Not the heart. Not the soul." She hesitated, looking at the bandages, then at his eyes. The blue was dark now, like the center of a flame. "I can't give you a son," she reminded him, tears welling up. "I can't give you anything but this." "I told you," Kevin growled, pulling her down until she was lying beside him on the narrow bed. The heat radiating from him was immense. "I don't want a son. I want you. I want the woman who dragged me out of the snow." He kissed her then. It wasn't the clumsy, brutal grasping of Tobias. It was slow. It was exploring. His beard scratched her skin, but his lips were soft. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was the one made of silver, not the dollar he had spent. When his hands moved over her body, Clara didn't freeze. She melted. For the first time in her life, she wasn't a duty. She was desired. They made love while the wind howled outside. It was slow and careful because of his injury, which only made it more intense. There was no pain for Clara, only a shocking, ascending pleasure that made her cry out, her voice mingling with the storm. Afterward, she lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow thrum of his heart. "I love you, Kevin," she whispered into the darkness. He tightened his arm around her. "I know, little bird, I know. underscore 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 underscore. February brought a false spring. The snow melted slightly, then froze again into hard ice. Clara felt strange. It started with a dizziness when she stood up too fast. Then the smell of frying bacon, a smell she usually loved, made her stomach turn violently. She retched into the basin one morning while Kevin was in the barn. It's the winter sickness, she told herself, splashing cold water on her face. Or maybe the venison was bad. She ignored it. She worked harder. She didn't want Kevin to worry. But by March, the sickness hadn't passed. Her breasts felt tender, heavy. She felt a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. One evening, while they were eating stew, she pushed her bowl away, the nausea rolling over her in a wave. Kevin watched her, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "You're pale, Clara. You've been pale for weeks." "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired. The winter has been long." "You're not eating," he accused gently. "My stomach is just unsettled." "Damn." Kevin put his fork down. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. He had seen livestock breed. He knew the signs of life in the wild. "Clara," he said slowly, "when was your last bleeding?" Clara froze. She counted back in her head. December. It was mid-March. "No," she thought. "It's impossible," Tobias said. "The doctor in town said, I missed it," she stammered. "Because of the cold, or the stress, it happens." "3 times?" Kevin asked. "I am barren," she snapped, standing up so abruptly her chair tipped over. "Don't you understand? I am empty. It's just sickness." She fled to the bed, burying her face in the pillows, sobbing. It was a cruel trick of her body. It was a tumor. It was death coming for her. It couldn't be life. Not after 5 years of praying and failing. Kevin didn't come to her immediately. He sat at the table for a long time, staring at the fire. He remembered the doctor who had examined his first wife. He remembered the signs. He stood up and walked to the bed. He sat on the edge and placed his massive hand on the small of her back. "We will go to town when the pass clears," he said quietly. "We will see the doctor." "To confirm I'm dying?" she wept. "No," Kevin said, a strange note in his voice. "Fear? Hope? To see if we need to build a crib." Clara shook her head violently into the pillow. She wouldn't believe it. She couldn't. Because if she believed it, and she was wrong, the heartbreak would finally kill her. But deep inside, beneath the fear and the trauma, a tiny, impossible spark had begun to glow, and the giant mountain man, the one who wanted no heirs, stared at his wife's belly with a look of absolute terror and awe. The journey down the mountain in April 1879 was treacherous. The spring thaw had turned the hard-packed trails into rivers of slush and mud. Kevin guided the wagon with a grim determination, the knuckles of his massive hands white against the leather reins. Clara sat beside him, wrapped in 3 blankets, her face pale and set in a mask of dread. She was convinced she was dying. The swelling in her belly, the flutterings she felt at night. She told herself these were symptoms of a growth, a punishment for finding happiness when she was meant to be miserable. Iron Creek looked exactly as they had left it, grey, muddy, and unwelcoming. The Broken Spur Saloon still stood on the corner, a monument to her humiliation. They pulled up in front of the doctor's office, a small clapboard building with a sign that read, "Dr. Horace Caldwell, physician and surgeon." Kevin lifted Clara down. He didn't let her feet touch the mud. He carried her up the steps and kicked the door open, just as he had done at the cabin. Dr. Caldwell was a man of 60, with spectacles thick as bottle bottoms and a moustache stained yellow by tobacco. He looked up from his ledger, startled by the giant filling his doorway. "Emergency?" the doctor asked, standing up. "My wife," Kevin rumbled. "She's sick. Her stomach. It's swelling." Clara was placed on the examination table. She stared at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "It's a tumor, isn't it?" she whispered to the doctor as he pressed his hands firmly against her abdomen. "Just tell me. I can take it." Dr. Caldwell didn't answer immediately. He moved his stethoscope around, frowning in concentration. He pressed deeper, causing Clara to gasp. Then he stepped back, pulling the stethoscope from his ears. He looked from the terrified woman to the towering mountain man, who looked ready to tear the building apart if the news was bad. "Mrs. Kincaid," Caldwell said, his voice dry, "how long were you married to Tobias Crutchfield?" Clara blinked, confused by the question. 5 years? "And in those 5 years you never conceived." "I am barren," she choked out. "Everyone knows. I am a dry well." Caldwell sighed, taking a rag to wipe his hands. "Mrs. Kincaid, you aren't sick, and you certainly aren't barren. You are approximately 5 months pregnant. And judging by the strength of the heartbeat, the child is as strong as an ox." The silence in the room was absolute. A clock ticked on the wall. Tick-tock, tick-tock. "No," Clara whispered. "That's not possible. Tobias—" He said. "Tobias is a fool and a liar," Caldwell snapped, his professional demeanor cracking. "But more than that, Tobias Crutchfield had the mumps when he was 19 years old. I treated him myself. It settled in his lower regions. I told him then that he would likely never father children. He knew, Clara. He knew he was the one who was sterile." Clara sat up slowly, the blanket falling from her shoulders. The world tilted on its axis. For 5 years she had taken the beatings. She had taken the insults. She had stood on that auction block and let a town call her useless. And it had all been a lie to protect a weak man's vanity. She looked at Kevin. The giant was leaning against the doorframe, his face unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her belly. "A baby," he said, the word sounding foreign in his deep voice. "A baby," the doctor confirmed. A sudden, guttural roar ripped from Kevin's throat. It wasn't anger at the baby. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage at the injustice. He turned and punched the solid oak doorframe. The wood splintered with a crack like a gunshot. "Kevin," Clara said, her voice trembling. He turned back to her, his chest heaving. He crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to his knees beside the table. He buried his face in her lap, wrapping his arms around her waist. "He stole 5 years from you," Kevin muffled into her dress. "He let you believe you were broken." "It doesn't matter," Clara said, her hand stroking his wild hair, a smile finally breaking through her tears. "It doesn't matter anymore. We have this." They left the doctor's office an hour later. The sun had come out, piercing the grey clouds. Clara felt light, as if gravity had released its hold on her. She walked to the wagon, her hand resting openly on her stomach. Well, look at who dragged herself back from the dead. The voice was like a rasp against Clara's spine. Tobias Crutchfield stood on the boardwalk outside the general store. He looked worse than before, thinner, his nose redder with drink. He was staring at Kevin with fear, but his eyes flicked to Clara with sneering contempt. "Refund time, Kincaid?" Tobias laughed nervously. "Told you she was a dud." Kevin stopped. He slowly handed the reins to Clara. "Kevin, no," Clara said. "He's not worth it." Kevin turned to Tobias. He didn't raise his fists. He simply walked until he was inches from the smaller man. Tobias shrank back against the store window. "She is with child," Kevin said. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the street. "My child." Tobias's jaw dropped. That's a lie. She's dry." "No, Tobias," Clara said, stepping forward. Her voice was strong, ringing clear in the muddy street. "Dr. Caldwell told us about the mumps. He told us you are the one who is broken." A crowd had begun to gather. Whispers rippled through the townsfolk. "Tobias is the barren one? She's pregnant? The giant fixed her." Tobias turned a violent shade of purple. "You lie! You whore!" He raised his hand to strike her. Kevin caught Tobias's wrist in midair. The sound of the grip tightening was audible, a grinding of bone. Tobias shrieked, dropping to his knees. "You will never touch a woman again," Kevin whispered, "and you will never speak my wife's name. If you do, I will come down from the mountain, and I will not be as gentle as I am today." Kevin shoved Tobias backward into the mud. The drunkard scrambled away like a crab, slipping and sliding, while the town looked on in silence. Kevin turned to Clara. He lifted her into the wagon with a reverence that made the women in the street sigh with envy. "Let's go home," he said. "Yes," Clara smiled, pressing a hand to the life growing inside her. "Let's go home." The joy of the revelation lasted exactly until the wagon wheels hit the snow line of the mountain. As they climbed higher, Returning to the isolation of the peaks, a darkness settled over Kevin. He became obsessed. He forbade Clara from lifting anything heavier than a spoon. He wouldn't let her fetch water. He padded the sharp corners of the table with leather. He watched her eat, counting every bite, his eyes filled with a terrifying intensity. Clara understood. He was seeing a ghost. Every time he looked at her swelling stomach, he saw Sarah. He saw the blood. He saw the grave he had dug with his own hands. By July, the heat in the valley was oppressive, but up in the cabin, it was pleasant. Clara was huge now, her petite frame straining under the weight of the child. She moved slowly, waddling from the bed to the rocker. One evening, she found Kevin in the barn. He was building a cradle. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Black walnut, sanded to a mirror finish, with intricate carvings of bears and birds along the rim. But Kevin was crying. He was planing the wood, tears tracking silently through the dust on his cheeks. "Kevin," Clara said softly from the doorway. He flinched, hastily wiping his face. "Go back inside, Clara. You shouldn't be on your feet." "Stop it," she said, entering the barn. "Stop burying me, Kevin." He threw the plane onto the workbench with a clatter. "You don't know what it's like. You don't know the sound a woman makes when the life goes out of her." "I am not Sarah," Clara said firmly, grabbing his arm. It was like grabbing a tree branch, but she held on. "And this is not 10 years ago. I am strong, Kevin. Look at what I survived. I survived Tobias. I survived the auction. I survived the winter. I will survive this. I can't lose you," he choked out, sinking onto a hay bale. The giant man looked suddenly small, defeated by his own memory. "I should have never touched you. I was selfish. I put a death sentence in you." Clara knelt before him, ignoring the protest of her knees. She took his face in her hands. "You put life in me, Kevin. You gave me a purpose. If I die giving you a child, I die happy. But I don't plan on dying. I plan on raising this baby to be as stubborn as his father." He looked at her, really looked at her, and the panic in his eyes receded, replaced by a desperate hope. The test came 6 weeks later, in late August. A summer thunderstorm was battering the peaks, thunder shaking the very foundations of the cabin. Clara woke up at midnight with a pain that felt like a knife twisting in her lower back. "Kevin," she gasped. He was awake instantly. "Is it time?" "Yes." The plan had been to bring the midwife up from the settlement in the valley, but the storm made the trails impassable. Mudslides had already washed out the lower road. They were alone. For 12 hours, Clara labored. It was a brutal, exhausting battle. Kevin was terrified, his skin pale, sweat dripping from his forehead as if he were the one in pain. But he stayed. He held her hands, he wiped her brow, he boiled the water and prepared the sheets. When the sun began to rise, the baby was crowned. But Clara was fading. Her energy was gone. "I can't," she whispered, her head lolling back. "Kevin, I can't do it." Kevin saw the shadow of death hovering. He felt the cold grip of the past. "Not again," his mind screamed. "I will not let this happen again." He leaned in close to her ear. His voice wasn't gentle this time. It was the voice of the mountain man, the bear. "You fight, Clara," he roared. "You didn't come this far to quit. Push, push for him, push for me." Something in his voice, the raw, desperate command, ignited a spark in her exhaustion. She gripped his forearms, her nails digging into his flesh. She screamed, a primal sound that rivaled the thunder outside. She pushed with everything she had left. And then, silence. Kevin froze. He looked down. In his large, scarred hands lay a small, slippery, squalling creature. A cry pierced the air, loud, angry, and undeniably alive. "It's a boy," Kevin whispered, his voice cracking. "Clara, look, it's a boy." He quickly wrapped the infant in a soft flannel blanket and laid him on Clara's chest. Clara wept, kissing the matted dark hair of her son. He was heavy, solid. He had his father's dark hair, and when he blinked his eyes open, the same piercing, blue stare. Kevin slumped against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He put his head in his hands and sobbed. Great, heaving sobs of relief that shook his massive frame. The curse was broken. The ghost of Sarah had left the room, chased away by the cry of a new life. "Come here, Papa," Clara whispered weakly. Kevin crawled to the bed. He kissed Clara's sweat-soaked forehead, then looked at his son. He reached out a finger, and the baby's tiny hand closed around it. "Jacob," Kevin said. "We'll call him Jacob, because he wrestled with God and he won." Clara smiled, closing her eyes. "Jacob," she agreed. The cabin was warm. The storm outside was breaking, sunlight streaming through the window to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air. But this was only the beginning. One child was a miracle, but Clara and Kevin were making up for lost time. Over the next 8 years, the cabin on the mountain would become less of a hermitage and more of a home, filled with noise, chaos, and a love so big it echoed off the canyon walls. However, the world below the mountain wasn't done with them yet. As their family grew, so did the legends, and legends attract attention, sometimes from dangerous places. By the spring of 1887, the silence of the peaks of desolation had been thoroughly conquered, not by industry, but by the Kincaid family. The cabin had grown. Kevin had added 3 rooms, extending the structure until it hugged the curve of the cliffside. It had to grow. The barren woman, the $1 purchase, had defied nature and logic with a vengeance. First came Jacob, the storm-born. Then, barely 18 months later, came the twins, Samuel and William, loud and rowdy as bear cubs. Then Sweet Rose, followed by solemn Elias. And finally, just 4 months ago, the house had been filled with the dual cries of hope and grace. 7 children in 8 years. Clara moved through the chaos of the morning meal with the grace of a general. She was 32 now, her body softer, her face lined with the happy exhaustion of motherhood, but her eyes were brighter than they had ever been. "Samuel, put the cat down. William, eat your porridge," Clara commanded, balancing a baby on one hip while stirring a pot with the other hand. Kevin sat at the head of the immense table he had built. His beard was flecked with grey now, but his shoulders were as broad as ever. He watched his brood with a look of perpetual, quiet amazement. He had come here to be the last of his line. Instead, he had founded a dynasty. But the outside world was encroaching. The sound of horses, too many to be a stray traveller, echoed in the clearing. The dogs began to bark. Kevin stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. The room went silent. The older boys, Jacob and the twins, looked to their father. "Stay here," Kevin ordered. He reached for his rifle, not with aggression, but with habit. Clara handed the baby to Rose and followed him. She wasn't the trembling girl from the saloon anymore. She was the matriarch of the mountain. Outside, 5 men on horseback sat near the barn. They wore city suits and dusters. The leader, a man with a thin moustache and a surveyor's tripod strapped to his saddle, looked down at Kevin with disdain. "You Kincaid?" the man asked. "I am. My name is Thaddeus Moore. I represent the Union Pacific. We've chartered a grade through this pass. This land is being claimed for the expansion. You and your squatters have 30 days to vacate." Kevin didn't blink. "I have a deed, signed and filed in the capital." Moore sneered. "Deeds can be challenged, especially when they stand in the way of progress. The government will seize it, Kincaid. You can't fight the railroad. Take the buyout and go back to civilization." Kevin took a step forward. The horses whinnied, sensing the predator in him. "This is not just land," Kevin rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "My son was born in that room. My daughters sleep there. I have buried the afterbirth of 7 children in this soil. It is blood ground. Sentiments don't stop steam engines," Moore spat. "We'll be back with the marshal." "Wait," Clara's voice cut through the air. She stepped off the porch, walking past Kevin, to stand before the horses. She looked small against the beasts, but she held her chin high. "You want to pass?" she asked. "You think you can blast through these peaks? You'll trigger avalanches that will bury your tracks every winter. My husband knows this mountain. He knows the rock." She pointed to the west, toward a jagged ridge. "The switchback over the Devil's Spine is granite, stable and clear of the snowdrift line. If you try to come through here, the mountain will kill you. If you go there, you live." Moore looked at the ridge, then back at his map. He frowned. "And why would you help us?" Kevin stepped up beside Clara, his massive hand resting on her shoulder. "Because if you come back here to threaten my family," he said, his blue eyes turning into ice, "I will not bring a rifle. I will bring the mountain down on top of you myself." Moore looked at the giant, then at the fierce woman, and finally at the 7 children who had gathered on the porch, watching with wide, fearless eyes. He saw something there that couldn't be bought or bullied. "The devil's spine," Moore muttered, making a note. He tipped his hat, a gesture of nervous respect. "We'll check the survey. Good day, Mr. Kincaid." They rode off. Kevin let out a long breath and looked down at Clara. "I would have fought them." "I know," she smiled, leaning into his side. "But we have too much to lose now, old bear. We have to be smart." Kevin wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "7 children," he whispered, shaking his head. "And I bought you for $1. Clara reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out a small, velvet pouch. Inside was the silver dollar he had thrown into the whiskey glass 8 years ago. She had kept it, polished and safe. "Best investment you ever made," she teased. Kevin kissed her, the laughter of their children filling the air around them. "No," he said, looking at the chaotic, beautiful life they had built. It was the only bargain in history where the buyer got the whole world for free. And so, the legend of the Kincaid family was cemented in the history of the West. They didn't just survive the wilderness, they tamed it with love. The railroad did go through the devil's spine, leaving the Kincaid cabin in peace. Kevin and Clara lived to see their children grow into strong men and women who populated the territory, carrying the legacy of the giant and the barren woman for generations. It is a powerful reminder that the labels the world puts on us, barren, broken, savage, or useless, are often lies. Clara's worth wasn't $1. It was immeasurable. And Kevin wasn't a beast. He was a protector waiting for something to protect. Together they proved that even in the harshest winters, life finds a way to bloom. If this story of Clara and Kevin warmed your heart, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. What do you think was the most powerful moment? Was it the auction, the wolf attack, or the final standoff? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have so many more incredible real-life inspired stories from the Wild West coming your way. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.